I was in Tahrir in Egypt for 2 or 3 weeks in late January, early February, as the revolution was unfolding. I saw a number of incredible things there. I'll just give you an example of one. In Tahrir, there was, amongst the throngs of people, there was demonstrations happening and protests and marches and chants all the time. At one point, there was a group of women, all of them wearing the niqab, so covering their face, just showing their eyes, and about 50 or 100 of them marching through the square, chanting very militant chants. Down with the system. We don't stop with Mubarak. We begin with Mubarak. Let's overthrow the whole order. We need to have a more just distribution of wealth in the society. So I started following them, and I said, this is remarkable. These women chanting this, and I wanted to know who's leading the chant, because in Tahrir the way it was modeled after the soccer chants, and it was one person leading and the other people following and repeating what the first person was saying. So I walked up to the front. As I said, there was about 50 or 100 women there. I walked up to the front, and I could hear the voice getting louder and louder. The person saying, "Down with capitalism. We need to have equality amongst all people. We need to have equality amongst men and women." And I said, "Well, I need to meet this person. Who is this?" And I walked up to the front. It was a 6-year-old girl. And that, more than anything, told me the fundamentally radical transformation of society that happened, maybe just for a few weeks, okay? It was ephemeral, and we don't know where it's going to go after that. But for a few weeks, people in Egypt completely rethought their role in society and completely rethought how their society was structured, to the point where children were even saying that the way things are structured right now is not just. And that glimpse into that transformation of society, I think, is important to understand. It's what I want to talk about a little bit today. For us here in the United States, it's hard to grasp sometimes that we have all these ideas that the sort of vocabulary that we talk about, the way society is structured, and how quickly those things can change. And that's what Egypt, to me, showed when I was there. In Tahrir, which is a central square in Cairo, people were coming every day, and in the first few days of the protests, it was just sort of an inchoate mass of people. It was very chaotic. Everybody was coming there and doing their own thing. Everybody had their banners, but what was remarkable is that as the days wore on, a sort of order emerged in the square. At first, when you walk into the square, or when you walk near the square, you cross a bridge, you go over the Nile, and you'll see people, men, women, children from all walks of life coming to the square. And they're carrying Egyptian flags, and they're carrying posters and banners. And when you get into the square, first there's an army cordon, and inside the army cordon, there's a cordon by the protesters themselves, and they set up security. They're checking for IDs, they check my passport and visa and everything. It was, for anybody who's ever been to the Middle East with all the repressive security regimes, it was the most pleasant pat down that I've ever had. And this is done by the protesters themselves. And after you go past this and they check you, you go into the square. And remarkably, every day there was new elements of order that emerged from the square. I mean, in the first few days there were speakers' stages. The money was donated by various parties, and the whole sort of there's speakers, and there was all the technological apparatus that's associated with that, and people were coming up and reading poems and reading statements. People were telling jokes. People were giving speeches. After that, in a few days, the protesters started to take over all of the establishments around the square. They took over Pizza Hut, and they made Pizza Hut into an organizing center. They took over KFC, and they made it into a clinic. KFC was not that I have anything against fried chicken or anything, but it's a symbol of the complete subversion of the order that was there before. KFC became a clinic. Doctors were coming into the square and providing free medical care. The care was of such quality that people who weren't even part of the protest were coming. I met one group who were coming into the square just to get medical care because it was better than what they would get outside. there was communal kitchens that developed after a week or two, because you have 100 or 200,000 people in the square and you need to feed them. So people are donating their food, they're donating their time, and they're setting up communal kitchens. When you walk through the square, you're just accosted by people who are handing you food, and sandwiches and everything. And of course, you have 100,000 people and you have communal kitchens, you need bathrooms. And so the students who are part of the protest donated their time, engineering students donated their time to develop, to build bathrooms. So they went in and they actually constructed bathrooms. So by the end of my stay, there was actually fully fledged bathrooms and all the everything else associated. By the last 2 days before Mubarak fell, the square was so packed with people that you couldn't actually even move. And this created the obvious logistical problem of how do you get around. And the protesters organized human chains, sort of like ropes, so that you could walk through the square. And if anybody, again, has been to the Middle East or South Asia, you know that lines are not something that comes very naturally to people over there. But incredibly, they were able to do this, and you're able to move around the square. And so for me, I was trying to wrap my head around how all of this emerged seemingly spontaneously, although I'll get to that later. But this order emerged, and I think part of the explanation for that is that the revolutionary process that happened in January and February led a lot of people in Egypt to fundamentally rethink their position in society and rethink what they thought about society and what society should offer to people. There were debates in the streets everywhere, out in Tahrir and also outside of Tahrir. Sometimes people mistook me for Egyptian. I was walking in the street and people would come up to me and they'd start asking me, well, what do you think about the army? Is the army good or bad? Should we support the army? Another group of people once came up to me and asked me what I thought about the Israeli peace treaty. Should we keep this peace treaty after we overthrow the government, or should we just jettison it? It reminded me, to an extent, reminded me of, I don't know if any of you have read John Reed's book, 10 Days That Shook the World, in which he talked about people on the street corners of Russia during the Russian Revolution, debating politics. People are reading newspapers, and everybody's debating what's happening inside the country. To an extent, it was like that. I mean, I don't want to overstate things. I mean, it was just a moment, maybe ephemeral moment, because the revolution in Egypt just overthrew the tip of the iceberg of the system in Egypt, right? It was just Mubarak and the people around him. And there's a lot more that needs to happen after that. But for that moment, for people who are living under 30 years of dictatorship in which there was no freedom of expression, in which any thoughts they had about politics or about their lives were kept in their houses, really, to be able to openly articulate that in the streets, it was really sort of a liberatory experience, I think, for people. But again, like I said, it was a moment, and there's a question whether that moment is going to be extended or continued into the future, or if it's just going to stay in January and February. There's a wing of the protesters who want to deepen the revolution at this point, who want to say, okay, we've gotten rid of the top of the pyramid, but we want to then have a thoroughgoing overthrow of society or a change of the way things have been done, because Mubarak is gone and some of Mubarak's closest cronies are gone. But the system to which Mubarak and his predecessors have put in place in Egypt is, by and large, still there, for the most part. And so that's a question right now that I think is confronting the movement in Egypt. And this actually, this brings to mind a lot of the commentary that we see in the media today in Egypt, which is that, okay, there's a revolution, it was done, Mubarak's gone, so now let's move on and talk about other things. But this issue is right now, I think, one of the major issues confronting what's happening with the activists on the ground. And these activists, particularly that wing that wants to deepen the revolution, they weren't a group that just kind of spontaneously emerged, even though that's what it seems like. There was actually, is actually a reflection of the patient work of activists, a small group of activists, for a number of years, which only saw its fruits in the last couple of months. Starting in 2003 in in Egypt, but there was a protest against the Iraq war. And a small group of activists went out and protested against the war. And at that time, it was very difficult to have public demonstrations, but the fact that this was against the United States and not against the home government gave a bit of space for activists to come out and demonstrate. Of course, there was an implicit denunciation of the government because the U.S. Egypt was supporting the U.S. in this war. But from 2003, you had some activist groups that were active in all these things, and then 2004 there were more protests. But by a point in 2010, there was a very vibrant anti-police brutality movement in Egypt. More importantly, starting in 2006 till today, there's a strike wave that's been going across the country, in which workers have been going on strike in large, for many reasons. The many reasons why they've been going on strike, but one of them is that there's been a real gutting of living standards for the very poor in Egypt. Neoliberal reforms, particularly by Mubarak's cabinet after 2004, but in general, through the course of Mubarak's regime, which have gutted living standards, really propelled people to go out into the streets. Also, the global economic crisis, which have propelled people to go out into the streets. And so you were seeing, in some days in the last couple of years, you're seeing 10 or 15 strikes in a day. So you had the protests, the activists who were organizing protests, you had the workers going on strike, and all of this led to a very combustible environment. All it needed was a spark. The spark was Tunisia. And when Tunisia came, then sort of the floodgates opened and people went onto the streets, and that's where we are today. So the revolution in Egypt, I like to think of it more, instead of a single event, I like to think of it as a process in Egypt where the first blow was struck, in which Mubarak and his cronies and the people around him were defeated. But there's so much more that needs to be done over there. I don't know where that's going to head, and I don't think anybody can know where it's going to go. But one thing I do know is that no matter what happens in Egypt in the next couple of years, that there's been something's fundamentally changed in that country and in the Arab world, and there's been a seed that's been planted in the minds of Egyptians and Arabs throughout the Middle East, and that seed is an idea that can't very easily be uprooted, which is that another world is possible in Egypt, in the Middle East, and I think that as long as that idea is there and that idea persists, that we're going to be talking about Egypt and the Middle East for a very long time.